numero di oggi. Bene, we had a guest, but she disappeared because she couldn't speak English. So next time, I don't know when, another person possibly will come to present you some activities related to Isaac or whatever. Or can you see the border from Atom?
Yes.
Good.
Yes, yes.
Good. Now we start with the question. Any question about what I told you last time? Any question? Yeah. No. Everything was clear. Good. So I mentioned two situations in which we have quite important failures on supply side, which were determined by technical conditions. In particular, I mentioned the fact that there are some goods that we call the Dupuy or retelling, which have an enormous amount of fixed cost. In the case of Dupuy good, we have only fixed cost, which means an equilateral hyperbola as average cost. By definition, that kind of goods have average cost which are decreasing on the relevant part of the demand function. Moreover, I mentioned the other situation of a telling good, which have important fixed cost, but also important variable cost, which means that we have in general an average cost which is a U-shaped, but also an important marginal cost. And in those cases in which we have this situation, and when this is important, the relevant part of the average cost meets the demand schedule. When the costs are decreasing, we are in a situation of natural monopoly. Now, I mentioned also the fact that, well, I didn't mention, I wasn't possibly too clear because I was thinking later on that it possibly wasn't clear the fact that on the demand side, we can find a situation in which the demand for good, the aggregate demand for good, is given by pure public good, which means that we are in this box of our reference scheme. But this might not be the case. And this is the maximum indivisibility, where we have on the one side demand for pure public goods, and on the supply side, the technical condition for natural monopoly. In this case, even if I mention the different way in which on the supply side, the amount of production can be determined, what happens for the equilibrium is also determined by how, say, the market or the government or whoever decided to share the financing of the goods. What I mean that if we have highly indivisibility condition on the supply side in front of a demand curve, aggregate demand curve of pure public goods, we have to find a rule for sharing the price between consumers, in which case we have seen just two of the possibilities. One is that of Samuelson, which means that given the equilibrium, whatever it is, it can be found all over the range that we mentioned last time, beginning from the low amount of quantity, which is that of monopoly quantity, up to the marginal cost pricing, which represents the competitive equilibrium. Whatever it is, the supply, the equilibrium supply in the market, we can share the price according to the rule of Samuelson, for instance, and cover the production cost by asking the consumer to, in a way, declare their willingness to pay and asking them for a price which is equal to the willingness to pay. And so you can imagine the problem that we have in terms of free riding, because we have first to decide how much to supply and then ask to cover the cost. And it means that a rational person wants knowing that the good is already been supplied, and you ask him how much are you willing to pay? He might say, well, the good is ready, is here, and I say, I'm not willing to pay, I'm not interested, given that he knows already that he can consume the good. Another way that we mentioned is the way of sharing the cost with the Lindal price. The Lindal pricing is quite different from Samuelson pricing, because it assumes that any demand schedule is determined by the share of taxes that each individual is willing to pay, is expected to pay to cover the full cost. And so we have to find an equilibrium that determines at the same time the share of cost of the good and the amount of good to be supplied, which is a way to find equilibrium if possible. And it is a good way if there is unanimity in the collectivity. Otherwise, it might be well happen that you have a collectivity divided into groups, and the prevailing one might be the majority group, only if there is nobody inside that group that can be better off by changing something at equilibrium. These two that I mentioned are quite different ways to working out the amount of the financing of a pure public good, and are not the only one. The literature in this respect is studying different way for financing the public goods. And knowing that the full financing just obtained by taking for the public budget the money, sorry, I have to admit someone. By taking by the public budget the money to finance the good is not a good way for financing, because any time that you disconnect the consumption of a good from the financing of it, you are and then you are imposed to ask for taxation to the consumer, to all the consumer, we are going to introduce in the system some distortion that affect all the market, which is not something that we like, but we will see the effect of taxation and later on in the lecture, not this one, but I think some weeks. Another possible situation, which is more often found here in this box, is that in which the aggregate demand for the for the considered good, sorry. No, it's not this. And that is this one. Which is very often found, mainly found in the health economics market, or even if public, even if goods and services are publicly supplied.
I'm sorry, I'm here for the classroom presentation.
Which presentation?
Classroom presentation.
For Isaac?
Yes.
But now you have to wait. I can't stop before, but you cannot interrupt the lecture.
I'm so sorry, we can wait it's outside. I'm sorry, guys.
So later on, I would say that, how long do you need?
10 minutes.
So what, 3:35?
It's on. We can wait outside.
3:35, more or less. Oh my God. A different situation is that we often found in the health market is that in which we are stronger indivisibility on the supply side, but a market goods, which can be pure public goods, pure private goods, which means that it can be divided in unit of sale. And this is often the kind of, well, the well-known situation is that of public utilities, which have strong indivisibility on the supply side, but the goods can be divided into unit of sale. But in the health system, this is the case, for instance, of pharmaceutical industry, hospital, and all the situations in which we have stronger indivisibility on the production side. And for instance, not for all the goods produced by the pharmaceutical industry, but for most of them, for which, for instance, the research and development expenditure costs are quite high. We have, in some cases, joined with the patent, which makes the difference. We have situations in which some pharmaceutical firms are in a position of natural monopoly in the market, even though the medicine sold to patients is per se a private good. So in this situation, if we go back to the story of hoteling or of Dupuy pricing that we saw last time here, for instance, consider Dupuy hoteling goods, which are most common in most cases. We have a range again going from monopoly pricing to marginal cost pricing, which is the competitive equilibrium, and also the budget balance price, which is a long-term equilibrium of price. So we know, looking at the picture, that each of them have some problems. Well, apart from the possibly the long-term equilibrium price be first. Why? Because, for instance, the monopoly pricing is not nice at all, given that it gives a solution in which the quantity suffer of a kind of rationing with respect to the demand. And the price is quite high with respect to the people that want to use that good. At the same time, if we push the equilibrium up to the competitive one, and we use the marginal cost pricing, which is quite good from a point of view of the economic market equilibrium, because it is going to restore the perfect competitive market equilibrium. We have a problem for the financing, because the average cost, in this case, I want it bigger, the average cost in this case is higher than the price, which means that we have a loss. And the overall loss is given by this area that must be financed by someone, possibly government or the like, which, however, is something that we don't like, because it requires to be covered with the public budget, and possibly by either debt or taxation, which is something not so good. So which are the other remedies that we can find in order first to provide the good or services, whatever it is, to the most individual that we can, and at the same time not to have problem with financing of those goods. Now we have, in this case, for instance, not only in those markets for health like the United States, where there is a strong regulation and a quite strong control of industry which have monopolistic characteristic, but even in those countries like the Italian, where there is a mixed system, which is mainly public, but it is also in part covered by the market. The way that we can use to increase the equilibrium quantity of goods provided to individuals, and at the same time financing the expenditure of this kind of goods, instead of using that way that prices that are in a way discriminated. What do I mean? The theory of price discrimination arises exactly in this situation, which it means that I have to discriminate in some way between a consumer in order to make, according to certain conditions, a personalized price for each of them. Now, we have three basic ways for discriminate between consumers in order to obtain the best result, which doesn't determine a loss. The first way to discriminate between consumers is that called first degree of price discrimination. I think I wrote that. Which means that I'm in the position of perfectly recognize each consumer and recognize his willingness to pay for the good. It means that if I know the demand function, this one. This is the demand function. I know exactly, given the quantity, which is the willingness to pay of each consumer, at each point for each quantity that I am selling to them. And I ask to each of the consumer to pay according to his willingness to pay, which is revealed in this case, because I know the demand function is very tricky and complicated. It's not so simple. But if I am in the position of doing something like this, which means recognize the willingness to pay of each consumer exactly, I can personalize the price in that I'm not asking a given price equal for everybody so as to cover the total cost of production. But I'm in principle asking to those consumers asking for quantity Q1 to pay P1, and those asking for quantity Q2 to pay P2, and so on. What happens at the end if I'm able to do it and I'm asking to each of them to pay according to the willingness to pay? What happens is that there are things that are quite interesting. I am covering my revenues correspond to the integral of the demand function because each is paying according to the willingness to pay. And once my total revenues corresponds to the integral of the demand function, I stop where? When I can cover the total cost. And this is quite interesting because I'm not longer in the position of having a budget deficit on the supply side because this red area disappears because I'm actually covering it with the part that I recover anyway in this place. What is the problem? One is ethical. Who gives the right to someone, even the state, to capture in the market all the consumer surplus? Because what I'm doing with this mechanism is exactly that. I say, so I know your demand and I'm capturing all your consumer surplus, which is not very good from the point of view of free market rules. Mainly because I'm also saying I'm capturing your consumer surplus and give it to the firm producing the good. So there is a double disadvantage, which poses actually ethical problem, even though it can cover the budget deficit, which is interesting. The second problem of first price discrimination is that it is quite difficult to recognize exactly who is the person who wants that quantity at what price, because on the one side, I can recognize, I can know the aggregate demand, but I might find difficulties in recognizing each individual inside that aggregate demand. So it is quite difficult. And in fact, mainly for the second reason, not for the ethical problems, this way of solving the problem of supply deficit is not very often used. It's not used at all, actually. And second degree price discrimination is quite more often used, both second and third degree price discrimination are used for determining a rule that defines a price able to cover in the market with this problem of indivisibility the possibility of budget deficit. So what does second degree price discrimination mean? And also third degree price discrimination. The second degree price discrimination is a situation in which I discriminate between consumers depending on the quantity that they want to buy. And this is quite often used, for instance, in the electricity market or in the energy market. Mainly in electricity is quite possibly more obvious for you. Is the situation in which if you are an energivore kind of firms, it's likely that your demand for energy is very high. And I can recognize you that you cannot be a family or household that consume energy just to let the light at night. And in that case, depending on the individual demand of each consumer, I can distinguish those who have a huge amount of these goods with respect to those having standard household consumption of energy. But same, of course, for the purchase of medicines. If you are a single patient with respect to hospital, so you might have different contract depending on how much goods do you want. If you buy medicines for the standard needs of an hospital, it's quite different from the situation in which you are a single patient that you need the medicine for your health needs. And on this basis, a different kind of pricing tools are used. And in the literature, well, you are not expected to know all of them, I just mentioned some of them. The most common are those called two-part tariff, which means that we have, for instance, for those buying huge amount of the good, so they ask for huge quantity of a good, they have a pricing which is formed by a quantity, a fixed part, which is expected to cover the cost, the fixed cost of the firms, and a variable quantity which depends on the variability of the daily consumption of the good considered. And with different criterion, a two-part tariff might be also done for individual patient. We also have different types of it, which are not very often used in health markets, but are very common in public utility, which are those in which for some peculiar good like energy that cannot be stored, but they must be offered depending of the consumption required. So I can apply those differentiated prices depending of the peak demand and dead demand. Possibly you have heard sometime that if you use at home the washing machine or the dishwasher at night or whatever, at night you spend less. This is a kind of the peak and dead pricing rule. You give to consumers the incentive of readdressing is preferences in order to help the market to not entering into situation of difficulties of supply. This very often happens during the summer where everybody want to, well, during the day, it's very hot and you need the conditioning open, and if everybody open at the same time, the air conditioning, there might be some disequilibrium in the energy market. The third situation, notice that this is also quite interesting price discrimination, because in most cases, you have to notice that in most cases, the goods supplied is exactly the same. So you are simply differentiating depending on the quantity required of the good. So the differentiation occurs for exactly the same goods, which doesn't change from the consumer point of view. The third case is that in which you can discriminate depending of the population characteristics. But the assumption is that the discrimination should follow the willingness to pay of consumer, taking the willingness to pay of consumer as a signal of something. That's something that I mean can be, for instance, income. What do I mean? I delete some of my previous work. If this was the situation, one could assume that, no, that for instance, in some cases, those who are in this part of the demand function are not those who are not willing to pay because they don't want the good, but are those, given that each demand function depends on income and preferences, are not those that don't like the good considered, but are those that cannot pay it. And if every time that we can do this situation, we can recognize for some goods and services this kind of situation, we can discriminate according to some characteristics. For instance, think of some benefits that students or over 65 persons have for buying some goods. For instance, ticket for train, facilities for going to theater or cinema. I don't know whether they still exist now, but in the past there used to be this kind of policy. And what do? I assume that, for instance, over 65 are those living with pension, and they are likely to be poor, and possibly they cannot pay the ticket for the train at full price. It's not a matter of tastes, it's a matter of income. The same is the same that I can extend to students. The income in general for students is lower than that of a standard person having a job. So if their demand, their willingness to pay is low, just because their income is low, I might assume in some cases that, for instance, this part of the demand is composed mainly from those persons, and I offer only to those persons having that characteristics, being over 65 or below 26, a special price in order to enter into the market and consume that good. This is also used, for instance, in Italy. In Italy, the situation is a bit variegated because it depends on the region for with respect to health. But in order to cover the cost, for instance, some regions like Tuscany assumes that some medicines, you possibly know, at least those who are here that I know are most of you are Italian, and you know that we have to pay a ticket in order to finance the price of the medicine that you are going to buy. And well, in Lazio it works that everybody is paying the same ticket, which is represent a kind of discount with respect to the price that is shown in the box that you are buying. In Tuscany, the mechanism is different because we are expected to pay a ticket as in Lazio, but the price that we pay depends on the income that we declare to the government when we pay taxes. it means that if my income is over, it should be over 80,000 euros for a year, I have to pay a ticket which is much higher than those who have an annual income much lower than mine. And sometimes it's very strange, this mechanism, because the price that I presume the rich person is expected to pay is even higher than the price of the medicine. Because the idea is that those who are rich are expected to finance those who are poor. And it would be, in this graph, choosing a sort of price like this. I'm asking this person here to pay a lower price, say, I buy not one, or even give the full figure, possibly give at a price which is lower of any other price. And I ask to the other part of the population to pay a price which is higher than the average cost, so that with the higher price, I cover the full cost, almost the full cost, and even the deficit, which is determined when I sell the good to those who cannot pay. What is the problem in this kind of policy? And the problem is that I'm not always in the position of properly discriminate. For instance, if I had a price tariff for which is ad hoc for over 65, and I allow all those persons who are over 65 to pay a much lower price for whatever. I'm not go then to discriminate exactly. I can do in the market, pharmaceutical market, because in the case of ticket, you need the prescription. So there must be a check, but for instance, I cannot do it if I want to make the ticket train with these two levels. So it might happen that those having it is called silver card, that for all people might be very rich. Berlusconi could have the silver card for traveling with the Frecciarossa all over Italy at a reduced price. At the same time, his son, or whatever, under 26 can have reduction on the price of something simply because of his age. But if overall this assumption holds, it might be a good way to discriminate among people. And it's used quite often on two different conditions. One is income, that I mentioned to you, which is used in Italy. In Italy, we have 20 different national health systems, because each region does whatever it wants. But some regions use this system. Another way is that of which is very often used and possibly also in a way imposed at the national level, is discriminating depending on the needs due to the gravity of the disease. So depending on your disease, if it's very expensive to be cured, because this is another condition always, determined by a situation which are not in the standard in this case, and independent of the income of your income and your family income, you might have access to cure or discount for being cured. Okay.
And I don't know if it's the same in Italy, but it's the same example for the university.
Speak up, because I don't think.
It's the same in Italy, but we can do it in the university fees. When we pay university, it depends on our parents' revenue. So there is
The university fees is another situation. I didn't mention it because it's not health, but education is another field in which this mechanism is used. in this case, for instance, in Italy, we discriminate depending on the level of education, because you have primary education, which is more or less free, and it's fully free if you are below a given income. At the university, is sometimes the price, the fees varies depending on the university itself, but for instance, Sapienza makes a quite strong policy for supporting those who have a level of what we call ISEE, which is an index that determines the income of the family, according to which you might have different pricing for the fees. Another interesting situation is instead that of using the train, because as you know, in that case, we have twice discrimination, because we have, I mentioned the third degree price discrimination, which depends, you have a discount depending on your age, in order to favor all people and young people. But you also possibly note that we have different classes, and take a quick train going from Rome to Milan, for instance. We have different classes, and you can travel in second class, business class, salottino. There is another one. And, sorry?
It should be executive, right?
There is executive. I don't remember all the option. And no, there is also another one, but I don't remember the name, in which you have possibly a wagon with only 6 places. I had to take that train once. Not so exciting. But in principle, you can stay like in bed. And this is quite strange. A part of this extreme case of the executive, of the upper business, or whatever it is. In the past, the situation of first, second, third class in the train simply meant that, well, third class was with seat in wood. The second was exactly the same distance between each other, but made of, how it's called, sort of plastic, but nothing interesting. But during the summer, it was very disappointing, because everything became wet and was disturbing without air conditioning. And the first class with velvet. This was the only difference for giving a service which was exactly the same, going from one place to the other at a certain speed, and you have the same speed in each class, but the only difference was sitting in something different. And this is quite interesting now. Well, there are not longer wood. I don't think we have trained with wood. They were quite old, but well, business class has increased the distance between passengers with respect to the past. In the past, not even that, because we have the boats have the same distance, and the number of places was exactly the same for first and second class. So you cannot see the difference just in the velvet of the seat. And this is quite interesting, because, well, although taking differences in the quality of the service, you can exploit your card in each of them in order to have a discount for the price of the ticket that brings, in any case, you from one town to the other at the same speed and with the same time. Now, we now pass to a different issues, which is that in a way related to this, and it's called of semi-public goods. It is related to the issue that I mentioned up to now of indivisibility on the supply side and pure private good supplied from this market, but we had a condition which is quite often found in the overall production of this good, which is, other than the fact that they are supplied with the highest indivisibility, the supply, at least at the level of the whole industry, is determines the production of externality that can benefit all the population affected, well, entering into the benefit area of the good considered. This was used to call the industrial district theory of Marshall in the past, but it's very well often employed to study some situation even in the photos industry, which are strongly innovative, which means that or for some situation in the health market. Now, the original theorem was referred to the whole industry. It means that an industry is characterized by a number of firms which are related by a peculiar production. For instance, the automotive industry is not simply the car, but it's also all those goods and services which are around the car. Or the movies industries or cinema industry is composed by a number of firms which are all related by the final good that is a movie. But there is not only one firm that produces everything. It is generally composed by single entity, which might be firms or branch or whatever. And for instance, polyclinical, I specialized in different branch of health, is a typical kind of industry which enters into the requisites of the Marshall theorem. Because there is, I am referring to those highly specialized groups of branch covering, for instance, those at the university level, covering different needs, very different needs, almost all, because polyclinical in general covers almost all the needs. Well, it depends on the size, but almost all the needs of a patient, and it gives, in general, high quality services, which also means that the cost on the cost side, the costs are decreasing with those characteristics that we have found in the telling types of goods. It doesn't mean that all the goods produced by each branch of a polyclinical are at that cost schedules. It might well be that in some situations we have constant costs. For instance, one branch is able to produce goods at a fixed cost or constant or even increasing, like the standard that we know. But overall, all the hospital in general, all the polyclinical, as in general, this kind of situation, and is characterized, in order to be studied, if we want to study it according to the Marshall theorem, is characterized by the fact that it is producing positive external effects of various kinds. And it happens for different goods. I should have a slide here. I was forgetting something. And the effect of externalities is such that it might determine in turn the reduction of cost given the level of production. Well, before entering into these details, I just remind you the story of external effect. We have already mentioned it, possibly in the first lecture, but in order for you to have a picture of what I'm talking about, I make it smaller. No, I want. I want this bit here. No, not yet. Now, we are, just to remind the point in which we are talking about market failure on the supply side. And what we are looking now are those external effects affecting the supply side. And in principle, whether we can have different types of external effect. You remember what is an external effect and what we mean when we talk about externalities? As something absolutely new, or have you already heard about it? Never heard about externality. No, even at home.
I think we spoke about it in health economics.
Health
economics, maybe.
As economics and policy, we read about externalities.
Part of the title of the course, can you tell to everybody what is an external effect?
When externalities affect just
Yeah.
Well, first of all, external to what? Because this is the point that is of interest for us. We have something that is an economic effect. We are talking about an economic effect originating from one of the agents. It can be consumer or supplier. And this effect is external to the market price, which means the price factors that characterize the equilibrium. So there is something that I'm making, like in my, whatever I am, a supplier or consumer, there is something that I do, and what I do has an economic effect on other individuals, because it might determine whatever it is, which can be economically evaluated, but it doesn't pass through the market. So it doesn't have a price. First of all, which kind of external effect can we consider? We can consider those going from production to consumption, from production to production, from consumption to consumption, and consumption to production. We have only 4 possibilities. And what we are going to consider now are those external effects determined by production. And which is the situation. Now I'm talking in general, not exactly about what we are going, about the externalities that we consider in a few minutes. Production to production means that there is the supplier of something, you say, own a firms in the top of the hill and is polluting a river. And the river goes down, and someone having an economic activity is damaged by the pollution of the producer in the top of the hill. And this effect can be evaluated by, say, the reduction of the production of the supplier that suffers for the pollution. But if there is no definition of rights about what is, who has the right in that market, either the polluter or the other who suffer from pollution, well, who is at the bottom of the just suffer for the damage, but it doesn't pass through the market. Different kind is that going, again, pollution is a good example for considering between, for externality between production and consumer, because the pollution can also affect the health of individual, and this is an economic damage which sometimes cannot be recognized or is not recognized by the law. And this makes a difference. The external effect can also be positive, by the way. And for instance, there are situations in which going from production to production, one activity, collateral activity, not regulated by laws of one producer affect the activity, positively affect the activity of someone else, which this is one of the cases that we shall consider later, or it can positively affect the consumers. We also have situations going from consumer to consumer and consumer to producer. Things of the most famous is that smoking that gives that produces an external effect mainly on other consumption, and depending on whether that situation is regulated, but sometimes it is not. In most countries it is not. Those who don't smoke might suffer for the activity of consumption of other individuals, and situations like this. Now, what is the solution in the competitive market? You have possibly already heard about Coase theorem. Have you heard about it? Hello?
No.
Never heard about it. Now, the story is this: assume a competitive equilibrium and assume a situation in which some of the agents are producing external effect on others that are not captured by a market price. It determines, this situation determines something that is not efficient from the overall general equilibrium point of view, because there are economic activity of the agents that are not captured by the price system. What can we do? For instance, take one, whatever of the example I have made, pollution or positive effects of any kind that are not taken, are not captured by the market price. What can I do to restore the condition that gives us the optimality in the market? One way to do it is that, first of all, defining the right, who has the right to do something. And if the right is defined, for instance, assume the situation in which I'm a heavy smoker and I want to smoke. And first of all, depending on the situation, there must be a right that is defined, which says, well, the person that smokes has the right to smoke in that place. And so if there are other people around me that don't smoke and I do have the right, I can smoke. But this doesn't solve the problem, because in any case, I have the economic effect, the damage on the other. So the effect is not simply captured by the right, the definition of right. So anyway, once the right is defined, what we do is we make agents to exchange. So I do have the right to smoke in this room, and you don't have the right to clean air. But what can you do? Well, if I have the right, you say, well, we don't want the smell of smoke, and we pay you in order to stop you to smoke. And this is a simple market exchange that can internalize the externality, so capturing the effect of smoking with the price. And if the price is good enough for me, I can stop smoking. Okay. But assuming the different situation, you have the right to clean air in this room, and I want to smoke. So how can we do? Well, one way is that you don't smoke, but I can say, I can pay. If you let me smoke, I pay you a price for let me smoke. And we open the market on the right. You are telling me your right, and I'm paying. Now, if every time that we can open the market between agents producing external effects, and if all the other situation of the competitive equilibrium, including numerosity, including what else, information, free entry and exit from the market, and the like, are guaranteed, we open the market and the external effect is internalized into the market price, into the market price sector, so as to avoid the negative effect of the fact that one part of the economic activity is left out from the market. And in principle, what Coase theorem says is that any time that we can open the market and let the individual exchange, and if all the other conditions of the perfect competitive equilibrium are guaranteed, I can internalize the external effect and restore the optimality condition. Okay. This might be true if only if, as usual, all the assumption of perfect competition hold. Otherwise, it doesn't work. For instance, something that's very disturbing and might not work, and might make the Coase theorem not work, is the situation in which the agreement is when a situation in which the numerosity assumption is not guaranteed. For instance, you are here, you are 6, those at home does not enter in our bargaining for smoking, and I am alone. So if I want to pay for smoking 1 cigarette here, it must be quite expensive depending on the number of people I'm dealing with. And it might well be that becomes much more expensive than my benefits, monetary benefits of smoking. So the situation might not be guaranteed. Or for instance, think of a situation that was quite important and it was related to the, not a long time ago, but enough, well, you are young, possibly you don't remember, but when Malpensa Airport was built, there was the point is if that airport was in the position of becoming the most important one in Italy, even more than Fiumicino, given that it was enormous, it was in a place which was then everybody realized that it was not so simple to be reached, not so nice to be. But anyway, at the beginning, it was considered an important place for the national airport in Italy. And there was a problem when it was built about the noise. And the importance of an airport depends on the possibility of night flight, well, intercontinental night flight, which means that coming from everywhere at any time, airplane are free to fly and take off without any restriction. Now, the point is that this activity is a kind of pollution, which simply depends on noise. And the point is that all the individuals living around the airport were very much disturbed by the noise, and they didn't want it. And the point was to consider whether there was a possibility of internalize this externality. So, and the bargaining in that case was from a few numbers of airlines, companies which are very big, possibly with a number of possibilities, economic possibilities that individually people living around don't have, because I know that I'm disturbing lots of people because they cannot sleep at night if I fly. But if their benefits is lower than the damages that they receive, the companies can easily pay them in order to stand the damage. But the opposite doesn't work, because I cannot ask individually to each person living around the airport to pay, say, 100 euros a month in order to avoid the night flight. It becomes very difficult to manage and quite impossible to realize. But at the same time, what I'm saying is also that an effect that is called the income effect strongly affects the equilibrium result. So the cost theorem might not work in most situations. So what do we do when the cost theorem cannot apply and we cannot restore the market with purpose of internalizing the external effect? Well, now before looking at this, now we look at the kind of external effect we are interested in, because of course it's not the situation of small effect. We are now looking at those external effects determined by those industries which are producing with decreasing cost function and generating positive external effect that government might want to incentivize in order to correctly guarantee the economic effect, their economic effect in the collectivity. So what are we looking at? It's very small. Anyway, we can divide the external effect in, maybe I can enlarge this picture. No, smaller. No. Well, anyway, it's enough that you look at the titles. Next year I will write it without explanation, but anyway, you can find it in Moodle. The kind of external effect that we are looking at can be divided in real external effect or pecuniary external effect. In turn, this real external effect can be specific, which always is, or atmosphere. Real external economies. We have also those cases in which we have pecuniary effect that pecuniary external effect. Notice that this is the kind of classification that is reported in the chapter I suggested you for the exam. There is a sort of debate between economists, which is related to the fact whether pecuniary external effects do exist. The point is that if the external effect, is that a pecuniary external effect is an external effect that affects prices. And if I do affect prices, it might mean that it's not fully external, because price is exactly a component of the vector of the equilibrium. Others support the view that pecuniary external effects do exist because they are generated independently of the price that is relevant to internalize the externality I'm considering. Anyway, you take this classification as given and look at the situation that we considered. What does specific real external economy means? Consider the district, the industrial sector that I depicted before, which is, say, a polyclinic composed of different branches of specialization and where patients can cure all the different diseases that they want at a high level of specialization. The fact that the existence of this district, of this polyclinic, for instance, into a metropolitan area like Rome, well, we have, by the way, more than one, might determine advantage which are specific and which are found by other patients that want, just because entered in the area of patient and other firms, just because they enter into the area of the benefit fallout. For instance, which are the benefits I'm referring to? A polyclinic means that there are branches specialized in solving some disease, specific disease, but also making research, but also developing new position or new medicine or the like. And there is a kind of information technology, know-how, and something like this that can be found for free or easy simply because the polyclinic exists. For instance, if I am a different firm who wants to enter in the market of Rome, where there are 5 polyclinics, highly specialized with enormous know-how, I am pretty sure that in that metropolitan area I can find personnel, knowledge, know-how that I couldn't find if I go in the middle of, I don't know, a small town, wherever. And this kind of external effect play a role of attractor of other firms that can exploit this know-how. There are also another kind of effect which are called atmosphere real economies, external economies, that again we can find in the case of polyclinical, which are all those services that the personnel of the polyclinic can offer outside their services in the main branch that can be found exactly because the polyclinic is there. As for the pecuniary effect, both specific and atmosphere pecuniary external economies are those that determine price reduction. And which is the case here? Well, it's not said there is a price reduction, but it is again the possibility of finding, for instance, persons who are specialized in doing a given task in the polyclinic that once exit their job are free in that market. And if I am a firm that again want to place my main activity in the metropolitan area of Rome, I know that I can find that personnel. I don't need to form this personnel, or because it's already that individuals already know everything is needed for my activity. And this is a price reduction information activity, which is quite important. And the difference between the atmosphere and specific, in this case, is given by the situation in which atmosphere price reduction are available for everybody, for any kind of firm that might want to enter into that market. Those specific are those related to firms that want to enter in that market and know that there they can find peculiar professionality that depends exactly on the fact that personnel of the polyclinic is found there. Now, when all these situations old, or when even one of them old and related to a district or an hospital or a polyclinic or a medical campus or the like, satisfies one of those possibilities. That might be the case that peculiar activity of the polyclinic or the technical campus or a given university, by the way, might be subsidized by the government. Now, I bit late. I know that the person sometimes appears in order to see if she can come, and we can talk about how to deal with this situation next time on Tuesday. Then, after this part, which means on next Tuesday, I'll be here, and also on Thursday, and I finish this part. Then Professor Giuliato will make 2 lectures on the global public good in order to close this bit, but she is quite an expert of global public goods, and she shall develop, she needs 2 lectures on those. And then I start again with the market failure on the demand side. So we now finish, I need this and the next lecture, and then for 2 lectures you will close these issues with the global public goods, which is, the importance of this that is becoming quite important. They were not known as such when I was a student, but mainly because of pollution problem or after the pandemic, possibly that injection per se, which is technically a private good, should be considered a global public good, and it should be treated, even if technically it's not, should be treated as such. And this poses some problem, as well as those related to the global warming or the like. It's quite difficult, even in those cases, to focus and find which is the right situation to be considered. Anyway, all these points shall be afforded with Professor Turiato, not next week after that. Now I leave Isaac to come. No, please don't leave.
Hi. Hi, good evening.
So please, if you want to stay, now there is the presentation that was announced at the beginning of the lecture. And we have a guest, I don't know her name.
Michelle.
Michelle is now telling you something and it will take how much? 10 minutes?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
10 minutes if you want to listen. I don't know exactly what she's talking about, but please. She is our guest.
Can I
Yes.
use